Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on The Teeth of the Comb and Other Stories by Osama Alomar. This is an excellent collection. Although it's a short book, it comprises a huge number of short stories because Alomar writes microfiction primarily. A number of these stories are parables or even fables, in which Alomar is taking everyday objects, very quotidian, simple objects, and using them to probe at these ideas and these questions around what he's experienced in his life, specifically the violence he's experienced in his life, his community, his nation of experience, because Alomar has been living in exile from his homeland of Syria for a number of years. And this collection was published about 6 years ago, but it's excellent. It really is a provocative collection, not in a pejorative sense, but Alomar is continually taking these items from life, these moments from life, and he asks us to reflect on them from this other perspective, to develop some form of empathy for the individuals like Alomar and his family and his community and what they have experienced. And he does it in such microscopic precision and detail. So he has a simple one called The Knife. It's 2 sentences long. He was born with a silver knife in his mouth, and he was its first victim. And we are immediately left with questions. We have this startling image. We have the knife in the mouth, and then we have the idea that this person is a victim. Well, how was the knife oriented so that he could become its victim? Usually we think of a proverbial silver spoon in a person's mouth, and this idea of class. And that's something that Alomar returns to in a number of these stories. But again, we're left with so many questions. Was this some type of class issue? Because the titular story, The Teeth of the Comb, develops a little bit more and gives us some other ideas to think about. Some of the teeth of the comb were envious of human class differences. They strived desperately to increase their height, and when they succeeded, began to look with disdain on their colleagues below. After a little while, the comb's owner felt a desire to comb his hair, but when he found it in this state, he threw it in the garbage. And so we're given that idea, of course, the comb being almost this society in which people have sort of pushed against each other and torn their society apart, and now the society itself is discarded. But Alomar doesn't tell us who is the owner of the comb. Is it some dictator or tyrant? Because he suggests that in numerous other stories within his book. Is it perhaps God or some supernatural figure? And so Alomar is constantly giving us an image and saying, you need to pay attention to this. Think about this. Think about this from the perspective you have, but try to think about it from the perspective of myself as a writer, and of Alomar himself as the writer, and then reconcile yourself on some level. What what reflection is stimulated in these stories? Another one suggests sort of this idea. It's called Ants. When I crushed a large number of ants by accident with my feet, I realized that weakness is punishment without wrongdoing. And yes, there's a moralizing nature to these stories, but again, it's through these images, these moments that cause us to think, that really do demand a level of our humanity as readers. And there are so many examples. The garlic and the flour. The owner of the house put the bag of garlic he had brought from the market on the table and went in the bedroom to change his clothes. The garlic looked with disgust at a flour that was on the same table, saying, "Couldn't that fool have put me anywhere else except near this stinking thing?" And those types of inversions are so consistent across Alomar's work. He continually places this moment that we think from one perspective, oh, it's the garlic that smells bad, the flour that smells nice, and yet from the garlic's perspective, the garlic smells as garlic should, and it's the flour that has this intrusive odor that's negative. And so in so many ways, Alomar is a brilliant and incisive thinker. Yes, there's an epigrammatic style, it's a moralizing style, and yet over and over, Alomar really gets us thinking. And again, to think in some of his longer stories, he has one that is a letter, basically recounting a relationship between two people, and the man ultimately saying, I have to leave, I'm getting on a plane and I'm leaving Syria. I will probably never see this land again, and I may never see you again. And what has that meant for their relationship? And by longer story, I mean a story that's roughly 3 to 4 pages. Because Alomar really does believe in this concision, this snapshot, this image that we can look at and circle from a couple of different perspectives, ultimately to draw back into this sense of how do we connect, what do we see in ourselves from this, and then what do we need to see in others. And so it really is a collection I cannot recommend highly enough. It is very short, but I wouldn't rush through it. The first time I read it, I sort of was just compulsively reading story after story, parable after parable, and finding so much to appreciate in Alomar's writing. and the questions he was asking, and yet I found myself sort of looping back and returning to stories and wanting to spend a little bit more time over the course of a week just returning to the pages and thinking through ideas from Alomar's perspective. So I would really, really recommend this if you can get your hands on it. Reminded of numerous works, certainly reminded of something like The Chattering Wagtails of Mikuyu Prison from Jack Mapanya. Yes, these are poems, and these are short story microfiction parables, and yet the political realities are so similar. And the way that Alomar has this sense of imagery that he's focused on in his stories really does have a poetic quality to it. Again, the poems of Ilala, the poems of Lalded, the way that she has images, the way that she has a moral, a spiritual truth that she's looking for, and that the school of writers around her are looking for through their poetry. Something else that I recommend reading over the course of time, over the course of perhaps a month. The Epigrams of Martial, of course, best collected, I think, in Martial in English. This is an excellent, excellent writer. In a different tack, we have the Novels in 3 Lines by Félix Fénéon, who took, I believe it was newspaper articles and newspaper headlines, and basically used those to just tell these tiny microfiction stories that in some ways are very comparable. Having stolen 5,000 francs from an officer at Épernay, soldier Guillaume concocted a story involving burglars, but in vain. And it's just a single sentence that summarizes some story, some moment. And his aren't necessarily quite as, brutally realistic, asking us to examine this brutal truth of reality. There's a comedy and an irony to a number of these from Fénéon, but it's, I think, very comparable. Another one I was reminded of were the stories of Italo Calvino in Cosmic Comics, where he's sort of taking this birth and evolution of the universe, development of the universe, and then the way that Invisible Cities has this narrator who's describing things, but ultimately is describing this aspect and truth of the human condition. There's a way, one of the stories that Alomar has, he has nature saying, nature as this narrator saying, "Oh, everything is supposed to work the way it should. That is my way." And then a tyrant replies, "As long as it's under my authority." And that's in a sense sort of the way that Calvino wants to explore these ideas within this context that feels slightly tyrannical. Certainly, I couldn't talk about microfiction without mentioning the great Lydia Davis. Or I think there's a good comparison to Jerzy Kosinski and Steps. These are very short, somewhat linked stories that feel very dangerous, very close to the edge of a margin of society that feels very dangerous. And then Neshani Andreas in The Purple Violet of Oshaantu was asked sort of, why do you present a society that, looks at essentially like people who unfortunately are, like, their life is filled with violence, is filled with dread, is filled with fear, is filled with poverty, and saying, I'm not exclusively looking at that, I'm looking out and this is what I see. And I think in a very real and true sense, that is what Alomar experienced and saw and wanted to present to the world. So I would recommend that you read this. Let me know if you've read anything else by Alomar. I know he helped translate this himself, so looking forward to seeing what else he can share with the world. And thank you.